A teacher bullied a poor student, but he came back rich years later. Mateo Rosario was only 9 when he first realized how little he had compared to his classmates. The crisp autumn air carried the scent of freshly sharpened pencils and new notebooks on that first day of school at Elmwood Elementary. Rows of suburban houses surrounded the campus, each with neatly trimmed lawns and cars parked in driveways, a setting that felt oddly peaceful yet so different from what Mateo knew at home. While other kids wore bright new clothes and showed off fancy backpacks, Mateo arrived in slightly worn sneakers and lugged his older sister's hand-me-down bag, the straps patched up where they had frayed. He tried not to feel self-conscious. As he stepped into Mrs. Hampton's 5th grade classroom, he clutched the bag's handles tight, hoping no one would notice the tattered edges or the faint ink stains left by his sister's scribbles. The door squeaked behind him. Rows of desks faced the blackboard, where cursive letters were displayed carefully along the top. Mrs. Hampton herself stood by a large wooden desk at the front of the room, flipping through papers. She was tall, with curly, graying hair and a pair of rectangular glasses perched on her nose. At a glance, she looked grandmotherly, but something about her curt, tight-lipped expression made Mateo's stomach flutter with nerves. He mustered a polite smile as he approached. "Good morning," he said softly, voice trembling with the unease that accompanied any new school year. His previous teacher, Mr. Saunders, had been kindly, often giving him extra help with reading. This year, though, Mateo felt uncertain. Mrs. Hampton barely glanced at him, her gaze flicking from his face to the scuffed sneakers on his feet. "You must be Rosario," she said, pronouncing the name slowly as though uncertain. "Desk in the back row." She pointed with a pen, already turning away as if he were an afterthought. Heat pricked Mateo's cheeks. He mumbled a thank you and threaded through the desks, ignoring the curious or bored stares of other kids. He lowered himself into the seat, noticing a tiny crack in the plastic surface. A part of him hoped this year would be better for him academically. He was a shy kid, always trying his best, but even at 9, he'd learned that life at home, scraping by on meager finances, made him feel out of place around other children who were better off. The morning routine went by in a blur. Roll call, class rules, seat assignments. Mrs. Hampton's tone was clipped, her expectations strict. She demanded that students keep their work immaculate and their desks even cleaner. During a writing exercise, she strolled the aisles, observing everyone's progress, occasionally offering grudging praise to those whose spelling or handwriting impressed her. When she arrived at Mateo's desk, he looked up hopefully, maybe expecting a quick, "well done," or at least a nod. Instead, she frowned. His pencil was short, sharpened down to half its original size, and the eraser was nearly gone. He'd rummaged for it in his sister's old pencil case because it was all they had at home. His family was behind on rent that month. Buying new school supplies didn't rank high on the priority list. Mrs. Hampton tapped the stubby pencil with her own perfectly manicured fingernail. "Is that really the best you can do?" she asked, her voice a low mutter meant for only him to hear. Mateo's stomach twisted in embarrassment. "It, still works," he managed. She pursed her lips, her disapproval etched in every line of her face. "If you're not going to take this class seriously, you'll fall behind," she said, then moved on before he could respond. He felt a burning behind his eyes. It was just a pencil, but her comment stung more than any playground taunt might have. In that moment, a seed of dread planted itself in his heart. He realized she might see him as nothing but a poor, unprepared child, someone not worth encouraging. That first day set the tone for the rest of the year. Whenever group projects started, Mrs. Hampton made sure to place Mateo in the far corner, seldom calling on him to answer questions in front of the class. He noticed how she gave more enthusiastic support to kids who wore brand new sneakers or boasted about their latest gadgets. She seemed drawn to them, praising them for trivial things. Meanwhile, Mateo tried to keep his head down, to study hard, but it felt like he was invisible or, worse, unwelcome. One afternoon, the class had an assignment to create a small poster about their families. Most kids brought glossy photos or printed images. Mateo didn't own a printer, and they rarely took pictures at home. He cut out pictures from old magazines, trying to find something that resembled his mom, older sister, and younger brother, and glued them onto a piece of scrap paper. It looked shabby, with the edges curling despite his best attempts. When the students hung their posters on a bulletin board, Mrs. Hampton inspected each one. When she reached Mateo's poster, a faint sneer tugged at her lips. "You couldn't find real photos?" she asked quietly, though a few classmates nearby overheard. They tittered. Everyone else put in real effort. She turned away, shaking her head. Mateo's face burned. He wanted to shout that he did try, that not having money for a camera or printed photos wasn't laziness, but he simply swallowed his protest. He understood that in Mrs. Hampton's eyes, he was the poor kid who didn't measure up. Incidents like that stacked up over the months. Sometimes, the teacher would hand back an assignment and, in front of the whole class, say things like, "You see this? More sloppy handwriting. Why can't you use better supplies, Mateo? Or if you keep turning in half-finished work, you'll end up going nowhere." Each bar bit deeper than the last. Mateo was a sensitive boy. He didn't argue back or talk to the principal. A part of him believed that complaining would only make things worse. Mrs. Hampton was an adult, an authority figure, and who would side with him if he spoke up? The final straw came one rainy autumn day. The class was required to bring in a particular brand of modeling clay for an art project. The supply list had been sent home weeks before, but Mateo's mom, struggling to pay the electricity bill that month, couldn't spare the extra money. Instead, she rummaged in the cupboard and found a cheaper brand at a discount store, a different color, lower quality, but still workable. She apologized to Mateo that morning, tears in her eyes because she knew he'd stand out, but it was all they could afford. When it was time for the art activity, the kids took out their uniform sets of clay, except Mateo, who opened a small plastic container of off-brand lumps. Mrs. Hampton strode down the rows, checking each student's materials. When she reached Mateo, she snatched up the container, reading the label. In front of everyone, she let out a disapproving sigh. "Rosario, what is this?" Her voice carried brittle edge. "We specifically asked for the proper clay. Don't you follow instructions?" He swallowed, cheeks aflame, as the entire class turned to stare. My mom couldn't. This was all we had." He tried to keep his tone even, but his voice wavered. Mrs. Hampton shook her head, exhaling sharply. "This is exactly what I've been talking about. If you won't even do the bare minimum, how do you expect to succeed? Honestly, it's not surprising you're always behind." A hush fell. Some kids smirked, others looked uneasy. Mateo felt his chest tighten. The teacher's words hung in the air like an accusation of worthlessness. He wanted to vanish. Instead, he blinked back tears and forced himself to meet her gaze. For a brief moment, he felt a surge of defiance. He wanted to yell that it wasn't his fault, that money was tight, that he stayed up late studying while she probably assumed he was lazy. But his throat closed and the moment passed. He remained silent, eyes lowered, and heard Mrs. Hampton mutter, "Just use your subpar materials. But don't complain if your work suffers." Then she turned and continued her inspection of other desks. That was the day Mateo truly reached his breaking point. He understood, in a stark, heartbreaking flash, that this adult, the one who was supposed to nurture students, had written him off entirely. She didn't merely ignore him. She actively disdained him. It felt like she believed poverty was some moral failing of his, that being poor made him lesser in her eyes. After class, he fled the building, eyes down, ignoring the drizzle that soaked through his thin jacket. His mom picked him up in their old beat-up car. On the drive home, he stared out the window, silent. She noticed his expression but didn't press him, likely sensing his sadness. That night, as he lay in bed, staring at the water-stained ceiling, he resolved something. Someday, he'd prove her wrong. He didn't know how or when, but a fierce determination budded inside him. He might not have fancy supplies or money now, but he had dreams and a willingness to work. The rest of that school year dragged on. Mateo's grades held steady in the middle range, though that was mostly due to his own efforts. Mrs. Hampton rarely offered help. He never forgot her barbed comments. Each time she singled him out, it fueled his vow to do better. By the time the school year ended, he had no illusions about winning her favor. On the last day, she handed him his report card without so much as a farewell. He took it, head held high, and walked out of her classroom for what he hoped was the final time. Middle school and high school proved challenging, but also liberating in a way. He encountered other teachers who saw his potential, who recognized that financial struggles didn't define a student's worth. Those mentors encouraged him to sign up for after-school programs, to join math club and the track team. Mateo blossomed academically under their guidance. Yet a piece of him always carried the memory of Mrs. Hampton's contempt, an ember of bitterness that he sometimes used as motivation. He wanted to make sure he never gave anyone else the power to belittle him for being poor again. When finances at home grew more strained, he took on small jobs, mowing neighbors' lawns, washing cars, doing chores. Every dollar he earned, he put aside for school supplies or to help his mom with groceries. By the time he was 16, he'd learned to juggle academics, part-time work, and family responsibilities. His mother would occasionally worry he was overextending himself, but Mateo insisted it was important. He believed in forging a better future, one where they didn't have to choose between the electric bill and decent school materials. That steadfast resolve paid off. He graduated high school near the top of his class. Scholarship offers came in from state colleges. He chose a reputable university with a strong business program, drawn by the idea of entrepreneurship. He remembered how Mrs. Hampton had sneered about his supplies and told him he wouldn't succeed. The memory still hurt, but it also gave him a certain fire. He vowed he wouldn't just get by, he aimed to excel. College was a whirlwind of lectures, part-time jobs, and new friendships. He studied marketing, finance, economics, anything that might help him start a business or climb the professional ladder. In his dorm room, he pinned quotes on the wall about success arising from adversity. Late nights found him in the library, devouring books on business strategy, leadership, and motivational memoirs. Each page felt like a step further from the dusty memories of being the poor boy singled out in class. A turning point came in his junior year. An innovative local startup posted an internship opening. They specialized in app development, combining social media with on-demand services. Mateo applied, heart-thumping, explaining in his cover letter how his life experiences fueled his ambition. He was invited for an interview. Facing a panel of executives, he calmly answered questions about problem-solving, marketing approaches, and his personal goals. Despite his nerves, the managers were impressed by his sincerity and drive. He got the internship. That summer, he threw himself into the work, soaking up every piece of knowledge he could glean from the tech-savvy environment. He assisted with market research, pitched ideas for user engagement strategies, and learned about venture capital funding. Soon, the startup's small office felt like a second home, a place where nobody cared that he once couldn't afford brand-name clay or new pencils. They only cared about his ideas, his hustle, his willingness to learn. By August, the managers hinted that post-graduation, he'd have a place in their company if he wanted it. Buoyed by that success, Mateo finished his senior year with top marks. He joined the startup as a full-time team member after commencement. Over the next few years, the company grew exponentially, attracting investors and eventually merging with a larger corporation. Mateo's role expanded, too. He became integral to the business, championing new product lines and forging partnerships. His reputation in the industry soared. By his late 20s, he'd saved enough money to launch his own venture, a digital marketing firm that specialized in boosting small businesses. He remembered the feeling of lacking resources as a child, and he wanted to help other underdogs thrive. The firm, Rosario Solutions, debuted modestly but took off rapidly. Mateo's passion and personal story resonated with clients. He approached each project with empathy, recalling how it felt to be overlooked or underestimated. Within a few years, The firm boasted a roster of high-profile accounts and garnered media attention as a rising star in the marketing world. Articles highlighted the founder's humble beginnings, from poverty to CEO, how Mateo Rosario triumphed. Each interview he gave, he recalled the sting of being belittled in that fifth-grade classroom, though he never mentioned Mrs. Hampton by name. He simply said, "I encountered folks who thought I'd never make it, and that motivated me." By the time he was in his early 30s, Mateo had made it by any standard definition. Rosario Solutions had multiple offices, millions in revenue, and a reputation for ethical, innovative practices. He'd earned enough wealth to buy a comfortable house for his mother, paid off his family's debts, and donated to scholarships for underprivileged students. Whenever he saw a child struggling financially, it struck a chord in him. He told them, "Don't let anyone treat you as less. Your background doesn't define your potential." Yet a piece of him remained unsettled. Memories of that humiliating year under Mrs. Hampton's gaze still gnawed at his heart. He often wondered what had become of her. Did she retire or move away? Did she ever realize how cruel she'd been? Part of him hated the resentment he still carried. Another part wanted closure. He never actively sought her out, but fate had a strange way of intervening. One autumn afternoon, a phone call came from the superintendent of a local school district. They were hosting a career day at Elmwood Elementary, ironically the same school he'd attended, and they wanted influential alumni to inspire current students. They had heard about his success story and asked him to speak. The moment he recognized the school's name, old feelings stirred, anxiety, bitterness, and a pang of curiosity. Would Mrs. Hampton be there? The superintendent mentioned that some longtime teachers still worked at Elmwood, though he wasn't sure who. After some thought, Mateo decided to accept the invitation. He wanted to show kids that success could rise from hardship. He also felt, deep down, that returning to those halls might free him from the ghosts of his past. So on a clear Thursday morning, he drove his sleek sedan to Elmwood Elementary, stepping out in a tailored suit, a far cry from the threadbare clothes he once wore. The building looked smaller than he remembered, though the facade was freshly painted. A rush of memories hit him as he walked inside. The distinctive smell of waxed floors, the rows of colorful student artwork on bulletin boards. He was greeted by Mr. Hastings, the principal, who led him to the multipurpose room where the career day was set up. Several professionals, police officers, firefighters, a local chef, had tables or booths. Mr. Hastings introduced Mateo as a successful entrepreneur and proud graduate of Elmwood. His talk was scheduled for midday. Meanwhile, he set up a small display about his marketing firm, along with pamphlets encouraging kids to find their passion. Groups of students, led by teachers, wandered around, exploring the booths. As Mateo spoke to a young boy who asked about starting a lemonade stand, he glanced across the room. And there, near a group of children wearing fifth-grade Ms. Hampton's class badges, stood a figure that made his heart jolt. Mrs. Hampton, older now, hair fully gray, lines etched in her face. She wore a conservative sweater and slacks, looking a bit frail, but there was no mistaking those keen, assessing eyes. She was still teaching, apparently, still guiding fifth graders, or so it said on the badges the children wore. His breath caught, adrenaline surging. A swirl of emotions washed over him. Anger hurt, a strange mixture of pity and triumph. She hadn't noticed him yet, busy telling a couple of kids to stand up straight, to behave. He observed her from a distance, recalling how formidable she once seemed. Now with age, she looked smaller. The memory of her cruel remarks came flooding back. Part of him wanted to march over and confront her, to say, "Look who I am now." But he wrestled the impulse down. Moments later, the overhead speaker announced it was time for the assembly in the auditorium. The various classes filed in, teachers shepherding them to seats. The principal asked the guest speakers to line up near the stage. Mateo found himself waiting behind the local chef, fiddling with a microphone clipped to his lapel. The plan was for each speaker to share a brief summary of their career path, then answer questions. When his turn came, he stepped onto the stage. scanning the crowd of children seated crisscross on the floor or in folding chairs. At the far side, he spotted Mrs. Hampton's class. She sat in a plastic chair, arms folded, her expression unreadable. Perhaps she still hadn't recognized him. Could be she never bothered to remember any poor kid from decades ago. Clearing his throat, he began. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mateo Rosario, and I'm the founder and CEO of Rosario Solutions, a digital marketing firm. The microphone carried his voice across the auditorium. I used to be a student here at Elmwood Elementary, just like you. In fact, he paused, scanning the crowd. I sat right where you are, dreaming of my future and also facing some tough challenges. He spoke honestly about growing up with little money, how it sometimes embarrassed him, made him feel out of place. He mentioned the side jobs he took in high school, the scholarships that helped him attend college, and the internship that launched his career. He kept the tone positive, focusing on hope and perseverance rather than bitterness. Yet he saw Mrs. Hampton shift in her seat, tilting her head slightly. Perhaps she was putting two and two together. I want each of you to remember, he concluded, that your circumstances don't define you. Hard work, kindness, and a willingness to learn can open doors you never imagined. A gentle round of applause arose from the children. A few hands shot up, and he fielded questions. One girl asked, "Was it scary starting your own company?" He answered it was both scary and thrilling. A boy asked, "How did you get money to start?" He explained about venture capital and small business loans. Another student asked if he was rich, and he laughed, admitting that yes, he'd done well, but wealth mattered less than making a difference. Then a teacher in the front row, a younger woman, raised her hand. What's the biggest lesson you learned in elementary school that stayed with you? Mateo felt a lump in his throat. This was the question that risked dredging up old wounds. But he steadied himself, letting a moment pass. I learned that how others treat you can shape your self-image, he said, measuring each word. Sometimes an authority figure might not believe in you. But if you believe in yourself and stay committed to your dreams, you can overcome negativity. He didn't name Mrs. Hampton, but his gaze lingered in her direction. Her eyes, narrowed slightly, met his across the crowd. The assembly ended soon after, with polite applause. The kids filed out in noisy clumps. Mateo answered a few more one-on-one questions from students who'd enjoyed his talk. Eventually, the bustle died down, and he found himself at the side of the stage, packing up his pamphlets. He considered leaving quietly. He'd done what he came to do, after all. But a strange gravity pulled him. He felt he needed to see Mrs. Hampton, if only for a moment. He turned to find her standing behind him, arms still folded, face cautious. "You're Rosario," she said at last, in that same clipped tone he remembered from a while back. A swirl of old hurt and new composure welled up inside him. "Yes," he replied simply. She nodded, letting her gaze wander over him. Her eyes flicked to his tailored suit, the confident set of his shoulders. "You've come a long way." He forced a calm smile, heart thudding. "I have." She hesitated, pressing her lips together. Perhaps she sensed the tension in the air, the unspoken memory of how she used to single him out. "That was a nice speech," she managed. "I'm sure the students found it motivating." He studied her expression, searching for a glimmer of remorse or reflection. The lines on her face were deeper now, her posture slightly stooped. Her voice lacked the bold authority that once terrorized him. "Thank you," he said. A pause stretched. He debated whether to confront her directly. At last he decided that if he wanted closure, he might as well be honest. "You know, Mrs. Hampton, I never forgot your class. I was that kid who brought cheaper supplies, remember?" Her gaze dropped briefly. Perhaps she did recall. "I taught so many children over the years," she said, but the tremor in her voice suggested she knew exactly who he was referencing. He exhaled slowly. "You said some things that hurt. You made me feel worthless for being poor. It took me a long time to realize that your words didn't define me. But I have to say, it drove me to work harder." She looked away, mouth tightening. I don't recall specifics, she murmured, but if you felt that way, He waited, uncertain if she'd apologize. Her voice trailed off, and silence hung between them, thick with unspoken tension. At length, she cleared her throat. I was always strict with my students. Some needed tough guidance. Maybe I overdid it. The statement sounded half-hearted, not truly regretful. Mateo felt a surge of disappointment. He had imagined her admitting fault, showing real remorse, but it seemed beyond her pride or capacity. He realized that the closure he sought might not come from her. Instead, it would come from within, knowing he'd succeeded in spite of her, or perhaps because of her challenge. He inhaled deeply, letting the bitterness slip away. In its place, a sense of calm empowerment filled him. He gave a small nod. We all make choices in how we treat people, he said gently. I just hope today's students have teachers who encourage them, especially if they're struggling financially. It can change a life. She said nothing to that, just pressed her lips into a thin line. Moments later, she turned and walked away, her footsteps echoing on the hardwood floor. Mateo watched her go, a curious mix of pity and release washing through him. She likely wouldn't change at this stage, nor offer a heartfelt apology. But that was okay, he realized. He didn't need her validation or remorse to confirm his worth. He'd risen above her judgments long ago. Outside, the day was bright. He stepped into the sunlight, feeling lighter, as though he'd shed a long-standing weight. A few kids from the assembly were lingering, waiting for rides or milling around. One boy ran up, eyes shining. Mr. Rosario, can I ask something? Mateo turned, smiling. Sure. The boy fiddled with his backpack straps. I don't have a lot of money either, but I want to do something big, like start a business or become an artist. Do you think that's possible even if you're, not rich? Mateo crouched so he could meet the kid's eyes, remembering his own younger self. How badly he'd yearned for someone to believe in him. Absolutely, he said, voice steady. It might take work, more than people who start with lots of resources. But it's possible. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise. The boy grinned, nodding vigorously. Thank you. He darted off to join his mother, who waved at Mateo with a grateful smile. Seeing that small moment of hope in a student's face gave him more satisfaction than any apology from Mrs. Hampton could have. He thought about how different things might have been if he'd had teachers who championed him from the start, instead of belittling him. But perhaps that was the path that molded him into who he was, resilient, empathetic, and determined to prove doubters wrong. He strolled to his car, the crisp autumn breeze rustling leaves across the parking lot. He glanced back at the school building, a place that once symbolized shame and frustration, but now felt like a testament to how far he'd come. The moral of his journey, he realized, was that adversity can shape your character in ways comfort never will. He'd grown to empathize with struggling families, to invest in young talents who lacked resources, to see value in each person's potential. He recognized the power of compassion over cruelty, of believing rather than belittling. Sliding into the driver's seat, he glanced at his reflection in the rearview mirror. Gone was the timid boy with patched-up hand-me-downs. In his place sat a confident man who had carved his own path. He turned the ignition, letting the engine purr. The memory of Mrs. Hampton's scornful expression still lingered, but now it fueled no anger, only a gentle reminder that he had surpassed her narrow-minded vision. As he drove away from Elmwood Elementary, the scenery of his old neighborhood passed by in a blur of nostalgia. The modest houses, the corner store, the worn sidewalks where he once rode a borrowed bike. He felt a surge of gratitude for the struggles that toughened him, for the teachers who had cared, for the mentors who recognized his spark. Life wasn't about erasing the past, he decided, but about learning from it, evolving, and using your success to uplift others who stand where you once stood. In the weeks that followed, Mateo redoubled his philanthropic efforts. He poured funds into a scholarship program for underprivileged students, naming it in honor of his mother. He also visited local schools more frequently, speaking to kids about resilience and entrepreneurial thinking. He never mentioned Mrs. Hampton by name, never singled out the negative. Instead, he focused on the positive lesson. If someone underestimates you, use it as motivation to grow beyond their limited perception. The story of a boy once ridiculed by a teacher, but who returned successful eventually circulated, partly because local reporters found it compelling. They wrote pieces titled, From Underestimated to Unstoppable, the Mateo Rosario story. They asked him about challenges he faced in elementary school, and he responded diplomatically, emphasizing that not everyone you encounter will support you, but you can thrive anyway. He refused to cast blame on any one teacher, believing that bitterness wouldn't serve him or anyone else. Time marched on. Mrs. Hampton retired not long after that career day event. Mateo heard about it through a friend of a friend. She quietly left the education system after nearly 40 years. Some speculated she was forced out by changing educational standards that demanded more empathy, or maybe she simply aged out. The official reason was never clear. But for Mateo, it didn't matter. He'd left that part of his story behind. He carried forward the lessons, not the grudges. And so life continued. Rosario Solutions expanded internationally, forging partnerships with major corporations. Mateo traveled the world, meeting leaders, entrepreneurs, and dreamers. Everywhere he went, he championed the idea that a disadvantaged background shouldn't be a barrier to success. He told his employees, "We never look down on anyone. We lift them up. That's the culture we build here." On a bright spring day at a major conference for business leaders, he stood on stage as a keynote speaker. The large auditorium was filled with people from different countries, wearing business attire, eager to glean insights from his success. As he delivered his talk, he spotted a few young interns in the front row, wide-eyed, reminding him of how he used to devour knowledge. He touched on the importance of mentorship, humility, and giving back to one's community. The audience listened raptly, taking notes. He ended with a personal anecdote, though not naming Mrs. Hampton, about a teacher who once mocked him for his poor supplies. "Sometimes," he said, voice resonating across the microphone, "the biggest push you'll ever receive comes from those who doubt you. I was told, in not so many words, that I wouldn't go anywhere. But here's the thing. Nobody can define your future but you. Use the doubt as fuel. Let it sharpen your resolve. And when you finally stand on your own success, choose kindness instead of vengeance, because kindness builds bridges doubt never can." A standing ovation erupted. Lights flickered across the stage. Camera flashes sparked. Mateo bowed his head slightly, a wave of emotion washing over him. In that crowd, he saw hundreds of faces, some privileged, some from humble origins. But they all looked at him with respect, a far cry from the condescension he once faced. And that was the moment he felt truly free from the old shame and hurt. He was the author of his own story now. When the applause subsided and the crowd dispersed, a few young people rushed forward. "Mr. Rosario," one breathless intern said, "How can I start a company if I have almost no money? My family can't help me, but I have ideas." Mateo smiled warmly. "Ideas are your real currency. Start small, find partners, crowdfund, or work to save seed capital. But never let the lack of money stop you from dreaming or planning. You'd be surprised how many investors out there value determination." Another asked, "Were you never angry at those who put you down?" A flicker of memory, a teacher scowling at his off-brand clay, crossed his mind. "I was," he admitted. "But anger can become your prison if you let it. I chose to convert it into motivation. And once I succeeded, I focused on helping others. That's a far more fulfilling path than chasing revenge." They nodded, thoughtful. He offered each a handshake, then made his way off the stage. The conference staff ushered him to a quieter lounge area, where he could catch his breath. He sank into a plush chair, exhaustion mingling with contentment. Through the large windows, he saw a skyline, bustling with opportunities. He wondered if some kid in that city was right now feeling embarrassed by shabby clothes or old pencils. Maybe that kid would stumble upon his story, realize that wealth or acceptance doesn't come from brand name supplies, but from unwavering determination, from refusing to let limited resources cap your ambition. His phone buzzed with messages of congratulations from colleagues and friends. One text was from his mother, who had watched the live stream. "You make us proud every day. Love you." He smiled, typing a quick reply before pocketing his phone. Then he closed his eyes, letting the lounge's hum fade into background noise, reflecting on how life had turned out so differently from what a dismissive teacher once implied. Many years later, on a quiet evening, Matteo visited his childhood neighborhood. He parked near the old apartment complex, paint peeling, the same chain-link fences along the sidewalk. Memories flooded him as he walked the block. A few street lights flickered. He passed a small convenience store where he used to buy cheap snacks with coins he earned from chores. Eventually, he arrived at Elmwood Elementary's playground, deserted at night. Through the chain-link fence, he saw the silhouettes of the jungle gym and swing sets. A wave of nostalgia washed over him. He recalled how, as a child, he'd lingered here after the bell, sometimes daydreaming about being a success. If the older present-day Matteo could talk to the younger version, he'd say, "Don't give up, kid. One day, you'll stand tall and none of these humiliations will matter." He pressed his hand against the fence, letting the ghost of that shy boy fade into the calm, confident man he'd become. The teacher who once bullied him was just a footnote in his story, not the central plot. He had triumphed, not by lashing out or sinking to her level, but by excelling beyond her narrow perspective. Thus, the moral lesson crystallized. A single person's disdain doesn't define your destiny. The cruelty of a teacher or any authority figure can cut deep, but resilience, coupled with self-belief, can propel you to heights they never imagined. And once you're at those heights, the greatest victory lies not in revenge, but in understanding, empathy, and the commitment to help others avoid the pain you endured. He left the playground, the night sky above him dotted with stars, each one shining like a tiny promise of possibility. Climbing back into his car, he drove away, finally at peace with every part of his journey. The memory of Mrs. Hampton no longer haunted him. It simply reminded him how far he had come. And that knowledge, that sense of self-assured triumph, was richer than any bank account, more precious than any brand new pencil, and more enduring than the scorn he once faced.